Hello class, I hope everyone is doing well. I am very excited to present this lecture to you all as it is something that I've dedicated a large portion of my research towards and was the general topic of my doctoral dissertation work. So yes, I look forward to sharing my knowledge with you on topics centered around the control of human body mass. Now this lecture series is intended to address questions on the different underlying mechanisms related to body mass control using evidence-based information. In other words, the questions of how and why body mass changes. Now, oftentimes we are faced with these seemingly simple questions, and oftentimes we don't have a very good answer to them. Why? Well, because many don't really know how and why body mass changes, whether it is weight gain or weight loss. I will make sure through this lecture series that you all have a strong understanding of the fundamental aspects of body mass control, which I believe many people out in different health and fitness related fields really need a refresher on, or just simply need to learn, since there are tons of false information out there when it comes to especially weight loss and human metabolism in general. Now, in fact, you will see later that even those who work in professions dealing with weight control do not have even the basic understanding of how weight loss works. Now, to provide an outline of the specific topics we will cover in this lecture, first we will discuss obesity and how unhealthy weight status is connected to poor health outcomes. Keep in mind, this is not a discussion on body image or issues related to body image. It is simply a discussion based on substantial scientific evidence showing the negative effects of obesity on the function of various organs within the body. It is no secret that there are many health conditions linked to obesity. Secondly, I will discuss the fundamental aspects of body mass control, basically going back to the fundamentals, the basics of weight control or body mass control. Now, this part of the lecture is one of the most important because this is what many people in our industry do not understand despite being a quote-unquote weight loss expert. So I want my students to actually be an expert first by understanding the basics of weight control. Thirdly, I will discuss caloric or energy homeostasis or balance, and when there is a caloric imbalance, like a caloric deficit, for example, or caloric surplus, how our body responds to that. For example, when we are in a caloric or energy deficit, how does our body respond to that immediately? And if the caloric deficit is sustained, how does our body adapt? So another topic of adaptation. So topics like adaptive thermogenesis will be introduced and discussed. And with that, we will talk about the science behind weight plateaus or stabilization. We know if we undergo a specific amount of caloric deficit, we will lose weight. Well, we know that we won't lose weight endlessly. We eventually will plateau. We will answer the questions of why this occurs. Then we will end this lecture with some practical information regarding calories, which will help us transition into the final lecture series on exercise and nutritional considerations for weight loss. Now, before we dive into this lecture series, I want all of you to understand a couple things. First, when I refer to body fat, I will use the term adipose. This is the more appropriate and more scientifically sound term to describe body fat. Why? Because fat technically is not an organ or tissue. It is a molecule, a fuel molecule. Fat molecules in the body exist in simple forms like fatty acid or in larger stored forms like triglycerides or triacylglycerol molecules. The reason why adipose is commonly referred to as fat is because these fat store molecules are largely found in adipose. So when I'm referring to fat tissue, I will say adipose or adipose tissue. When I refer to fat cells, I will say adipose cells or adipocytes. So please take note of that, otherwise things may get confusing for you. So first, as I said, I want to start off by discussing obesity. Not only its social economic impact and the epidemiology of obesity, but also the physiological link between obesity and a variety of diseases. In other words, why does obesity increase the risk for disease and therefore increase the risk for mortality? You will then understand why obesity is recognized in the medical community as a disease. So first, we have some epidemiological data concerning the prevalence rate of obesity across the decades. You could easily access this information on the CDC website. So if you want to take a look at that, you can just type in some keywords on the CDC website like obesity prevalence rate. Now, much of the data concerning the prevalence of obesity is derived from a large ongoing database called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or NHANES for short. And the prevalence data is derived from body mass index, or BMI data. We should all know by now BMI is simply body weight over body height squared. And we also should know this is an imperfect measure of an individual body weight status. The word individual being the operative word here. Take note of this. Now, BMI should not be used on an individual basis and to determine whether one is obese or not. BMI should only be used for epidemiology analysis like this, to understand prevalence rates, for example, to get a gross estimate of a national or global epidemic, for example. Why shouldn't BMI be used on an individual basis? Well, because one of the two factors to compute BMI is body weight, which can be generally made up of lean tissue and adipose tissue. And so someone who is very lean and muscular and weighs 200 pounds but stands at 5 feet tall will have a very large BMI. Does this mean that individual is obese? No. So as you can see, classifying an individual as obese based on BMI is inappropriate. So how do you then classify someone as obese? Right now, there is no standard or objective diagnostics for considering someone obese. In my opinion, someone can be considered to be obese when there is a presence of one or more obesity-related comorbidities or diseases, such as hypertension, dyslipidemia, or type 2 diabetes. So to briefly go over the prevalence rate of obesity across the past 3 decades, you can see that there is a steady rise in the obesity epidemic. Not only obesity, but also extreme obesity, as characterized by a BMI of over 40. Now, in fact, according to the CDC, the most recent prevalence rate is about 42%, which is another jump from the 39.6 from the 2015-2016 analysis. So we are now experiencing a disproportionate increase within the last decade or so. Now, as you can see here, the overweight prevalence rate has been pretty steady across the past 3 decades. But why do you think that is? Well, a simple explanation is that overweight individuals are becoming obese. So just looking at the changes in the overweight prevalence by itself over the years doesn't provide full context as to what is really happening epidemiologically speaking. So why is this data relevant? Well, first, obesity is linked to a high mortality rate. This is, again, large sample size epidemiological data. Now, on the x-axis here, we have age, and on the y-axis, we have years of life lost. The different markers here, the X, circle, square, and triangle, represent different weight class status based on BMI, as you see in this key right here. And we have results for male and females, as well as white and black populations. Now, as you can see, at any age, in any of these subcategories of populations, there is an increase in years of life lost with higher weight classifications, in that obesity is associated with an increase in years of life lost. When aggregating this data, there is an estimate of 95.7 million years lost with obesity. So clearly, in the context of simply longevity, obesity is unfavorable. And this is according to years and years of data. It doesn't mean every individual who is obese will live shorter lives, but this data suggests that there is a good probability that life will be shortened with obesity. So the question is, what connects obesity to a high mortality rate? Why is it linked to premature death? The primary reason, and perhaps the only reason, is comorbidity, or disease burden. Morbidity is relating to disease, and comorbidity is the presence of 2 or more related diseases. Now, obesity has been linked to numerous comorbidities, and we will discuss the physiological explanation to this over the next few slides. And keep in mind, more and more health complications associated with obesity are being discovered, including cognitive impairments. So to explain the high mortality rate associated with obesity, we can see that there are multiple diseases in connection with obesity, with each by itself having a fairly high mortality rate. Some of the major diseases are listed here: heart and cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes mellitus being the two comorbidities that are highly correlated with obesity. Now, some of these diseases are metabolic diseases and cause metabolic dysfunction, which means parts of one's metabolism is just not working properly or normally. Remember, metabolism is not just calorie burning or energy expenditure. That is an incorrect representation of what metabolism is. Metabolism describes all the chemical reactions in dedicated pathways within each of our cells to keep our cells running and for our bodies to stay alive. So when parts of metabolism in whatever cell starts to become dysfunctional, well, then the cells become dysfunctional, and then the organ that is made up of those cells become dysfunctional. And eventually the body can become dysfunctional, or in other words, disabled. So disability, more specifically chronic disability or long-term sustained disability as a result of comorbidities, not to mention the physical movement impairments associated with obesity, is what leads to premature death. So what connects obesity to mortality? It is comorbidity. Now the next question is, what connects obesity to comorbidities? What connects obesity to dysfunction in all these different areas, leading to mortality? Now, this figure represents the current understanding of the mechanisms linking obesity to those comorbid diseases or dysfunction in various organs in the body, as listed here. What appears to be a common factor in all these comorbidities during obesity is chronic low-grade systemic inflammation, or in other words, meta-inflammation for short. Now, the term inflammation by itself definitely has a negative connotation to it, but you must understand inflammation by itself is a normal process. It occurs in response to things like cellular damage, oxidative stress, or when there is some type of allergen or pathogen present in the body. It is part of the immune response and involves the release of tiny circulating molecules called inflammatory mediators or factors. These are often referred to as pro-inflammatory cytokines. There are multiple types of cytokines. These are released during inflammation by various cells, especially immune cells, to signal things like the healing process. So for example, if you tore your muscle, there is an immediate inflammatory response with the immune response. And there is an immediate release of all these inflammatory mediators or factors, which will then signal the process of fixing the damage, as well as things like pain to help protect the damaged cells or tissue. Now here's the thing. Inflammation is supposed to be acute, meaning it's supposed to be temporary. Not only is it supposed to be acute or temporary, it's also supposed to be localized to the affected or damaged area. In other words, the inflammatory mediators are supposed to be released for a short period of time and is not systemic, meaning the inflammation and the inflammatory mediators do not interact with other non-related tissues or cells. Inflammatory mediators aren't supposed to be elevated in circulation within the blood for an extended, prolonged period of time. That is abnormal. So what is chronic low-grade systemic inflammation? Chronic means long-term. Low-grade just means low amounts of inflammation, so low levels of these inflammatory mediators within circulation. Systemic means whole body. In other words, the inflammation is affecting the whole body in that the inflammatory mediators are elevated in blood circulation. So with that said, chronic low-grade systemic inflammation is abnormal inflammation. This inflammatory state is systemic, meaning the inflammatory mediators interact with healthy cells in healthy organs and start signaling processes that eventually disrupts the metabolism of those cells. It can also create unneeded inflammation in those healthy cells as well. And like I said, when there is some disruption or impairment of metabolism within any cell, the cell can become dysfunctional, which in time can make the organ of which the cells are a part of dysfunctional. So the major interlinking factor between obesity and organ dysfunction, and thereby disease slash comorbidity is chronic low-grade systemic inflammation. Now, the next question is, how does obesity cause this state of meta-inflammation? Usually, meta-inflammation begins with particular cells or tissues that are in a perpetual state of inflammation, causing a constant release of pro-inflammatory mediators into circulation and eventually creating a state of systemic inflammation. Now, as an example, there are inflammatory diseases like rheumatoid arthritis that contributes to chronic systemic inflammation. In rheumatoid arthritis, the joints are in a perpetual state of inflammation, which eventually causes systemic inflammation through sustained elevated levels of inflammatory mediators in blood circulation. This in turn causes problems with other cells and organs. This is why rheumatoid arthritis is a serious medical condition. Now, a similar situation is happening with obesity. So where in the body does the perpetual inflammation begin that ultimately contributes to this state of systemic inflammation during a prolonged state of obesity? There are two areas during obesity that undergo inflammation, eventually contributing to systemic inflammation. And these two areas are adipose and the gut. Now, we will discuss how these two organs are affected during obesity in detail, but in general, the adipose during obesity can become inflamed and perpetually release inflammatory mediators into circulation, contributing to chronic low-grade systemic inflammation. The gut also can undergo inflammation under a state of obesity, which alters the health of the gut and makes it leaky to something called endotoxins, which we'll discuss further later on. This will create a state of chronic low-grade endotoxemia, which in turn leads to chronic low-grade systemic inflammation. So let's go ahead and discuss all this in detail, starting with adipose and ending with the gut. Now, adipose inflammation during obesity begins with weight gain or unhealthy weight gain. More specifically, an increase in adiposity, so an increase in adipose mass and size. Now, we will discuss the mechanisms of weight gain later, but generally speaking, adipose mass increases because its cells, the adipocytes, also increase in size and mass. In other words, adipocyte hypertrophy. Now, the adipocytes enlarge during situations of overfueling the body beyond its needs, and that fuel can be stored up in the form of fat store molecules called triacylglycerol or triglyceride. Now, the area of the adipocyte where the fat stores accumulate is referred to as the fat pad. And so during weight gain and eventually obesity, fat pad inside the adipocyte expands. And this will cause the adipocyte to expand itself. It will cause it to hypertrophy. Now, in this state, the adipocyte begins to release pro-inflammatory mediators, namely tumor necrosis factor alpha or TNF alpha. This is because the cell is somewhat under stress due to the expanding fat pad size within the cell. You can think of it as adipocyte quote unquote damage. So TNF alpha is released by enlarged adipocytes and they begin to interact with neighboring cells in a paracrine fashion. Remember, paracrine from your physiology days, paracrine refers to how hormones interact with cells neighboring the cell that secreted it. So TNF alpha can bind to its receptors that are expressed on two types of neighboring cells. One, a pre-adipocyte, which is basically a premature adipocyte, and two, endothelial cells, which make up the walls of blood vessels like capillaries. Now, upon ligation or binding of the TNF alpha receptor by TNF alpha, proteins like MCP1 or monocyte chemoattractant protein 1, I'll say that again, monocyte chemoattractant protein 1 are released by these cells, the preadipocyte as well as the endothelial cells. So what does MCP1 do? Monocytes are a type of white blood cells, which are immune cells like macrophages. Chemoattractants are chemicals like MCP1 that attract something, usually a mobilizable cell, like an immune cell, like macrophages. And protein is an amino acid-based molecule. So monocyte chemoattractant protein 1 is a protein that attracts monocytes like macrophages. This process here is referred to as macrophage recruitment. This is what would normally happen when a cell or tissue undergoes damage. It's an immediate immune response. For example, when muscles become damaged after a heavy exercise bout, macrophages are recruited to the damaged area on the muscle to begin the inflammatory phase and the subsequent repair process. However, once the muscle is repaired, the macrophages essentially go away because there's no more chemoattractant signals for them to be continually recruited. But in the case of obesity, the large adipocytes, which are abundant during obesity, constantly release TNF alpha, and thus there is constant release of MCP1. Thus, macrophages are constantly being recruited to the adipose. So if you took a sample of adipose tissue and examined it under a microscope, you will see that obese individuals have significantly more presence of macrophages than leaner individuals. So what happens next? So as you can see in the far right figure, the macrophages are perpetually recruited to the adipose and it begins to accumulate on the adipose tissue. Now, macrophages promote inflammation by releasing other pro-inflammatory mediators or cytokines as listed here, as well as here. So some of these include interleukin 6, interleukin 1b, and more TNF alpha. And these are just a few. They also release MCP1, which facilitates even more recruitment of macrophages to the adipose. Now, these inflammatory cytokines altogether interact with neighboring cells, which would be the adipocytes, as you see right here. And this would initiate a cascade within, or a signaling cascade rather, within the adipocyte that eventually leads to adipocyte inflammation. Again, in a normal inflammatory response to injury or damage, the inflammation within the damaged cell is temporary. But because there is constant macrophage recruitment and a constant soup, if you will, of inflammatory mediators, the signal for adipocyte inflammation is perpetuated. And thus the adipose is now under chronic inflammation, which leads to metabolic dysfunction. In other words, the normal metabolism of a healthy adipose cells becomes impaired, and thus the cell becomes unhealthy, quote unquote. One of the metabolic dysfunctions is insulin resistance, which can lead to specific disease states, which I will discuss later. So with that, adipocytes under inflammation, as well as the macrophages, will continue to release pro-inflammatory mediators in abundance, and eventually the level of pro-inflammatory mediators in blood circulation will be elevated. Now, TNF alpha is a common blood marker for inflammation, and your doctors would test this to assess the inflammatory state of a patient. On average, the data shows obese individuals to have elevated levels of blood TNF alpha, which indicates some level of systemic inflammation. And now you understand part of that is from inflamed adipose. This elevation in blood pro-inflammatory mediators like TNF alpha is considered low grade. High grade would mean you are under sepsis, which is immediately dangerous. And this low grade elevation is also sustained, so it's chronic. Hence, systemic chronic low grade inflammation. Now, at this point, these pro-inflammatory mediators derived from inflamed adipose is now interacting with other cells in other organs in the body, such as the heart, the blood vessels, muscle, and the brain, to name a few. Now, eventually, this can cause further aberrant dysfunction in those cells' metabolism. And so you can sort of see how there is this cascade of damage being done. And for some individuals, this can lead to disease, such as heart disease, vascular disease, and type 2 diabetes, just to name a few. So as discussed before, the other contributor to chronic low-grade systemic inflammation during obesity stems from the gut. Now, this is based on some more recent evidence, and I find the dynamics here interesting in that gut health is negatively affected by obesogenic behaviors or behaviors conducive to obesity, such as poor diet and sedentary lifestyles. And it is also negatively affected by the state of obesity itself. Now, much of the earlier work on this was done in animal model research, mainly in rodent models. This is where they observed negative changes in the gut due to obesogenic feeding by force feeding a high-fat diet. And these negative changes in the gut preceded obesity. So it seems that it is obesogenic behaviors that cause poor gut health from these types of studies. However, researchers also observed negative changes in the gut due to obesity without obesogenic feeding by genetically modifying the animal to have impaired fat oxidation. So obesity was artificially induced in these animals. So in this case, the state of obesity seems to also cause poor gut health. So in the human model, this would be very difficult to ascertain whether it is obesogenic lifestyles or obesity itself that causes poor gut health. Now, the ongoing theory now is that it's really both. So lifestyles conducive to obesity, like poor dietary choices and sedentary lifestyles, and also being in the state of obesity seems to be damaging to the gut. So let's go ahead and talk about what specifically is happening to the gut. First, obesogenic diets especially, and also elevated levels of circulating inflammatory mediators due to obesity can cause inflammation to the gut. More specifically, the intestinal mucosal cells, which is part of the intestinal wall separating the lumen, which is the inside of the intestines, from the bloodstream. Now, one of the major roles of the gut, in particular the intestinal wall made up of these cells right here, is to control what gets absorbed into the bloodstream. And this is a tightly regulated mechanism. Now, when these cells undergo inflammation, the junction between these cells become looser, in that a gap starts to form between these cells. Now, these junctions are meant to be tight to keep unwanted things out of the bloodstream, like undigested food particles, pathogens, allergens, and toxins. Now, when the gut becomes leaky to these things because of these open gaps, this will activate an immune response because the body believes there are invaders infiltrating the bloodstream. And of course, with an immune response, you have increased recruitment of immune cells like those macrophages we talked about earlier, which will in turn release pro-inflammatory mediators or cytokines and induce inflammation in the gut. Another important issue with the leaky gut is the infiltration of endotoxins, especially lipopolysaccharides or LPSs. Now, LPS is a toxin that is present in the gut bacteria, which are microorganisms that reside in the gut lumen and aids in many gut functions. And LPS make up a large portion of the gut bacteria membrane. Now, obesogenic diets and obesity itself has shown to negatively affect the gut microbiome in that the gut bacteria can undergo cellular disintegration, which leads to a release of these LPS endotoxins. Now, in addition to that, evidence shows that there is also an increase in endotoxin-producing gut bacteria. These are referred generally as the quote-unquote bad bacteria, or more technically, dysbiotic bacteria. Normally, the LPS would be kept out of the bloodstream, but now since there is a leaky gut because of these opened junctions, the LPS endotoxins can infiltrate the bloodstream. And this would lead to something called endotoxemia, which is simply elevated levels of endotoxins, in this case LPS, in the blood. This is a problem because LPS can bind to receptors on various immune cells like macrophages, which promotes the secretion of pro-inflammatory cytokines, which can of course lead to chronic low-grade systemic inflammation. Now, another related detail is that during an obesogenic diet, especially a high-fat diet, there is an increase in fat globules called chylomicrons. Chylomicrons are low-density lipoproteins, so they're part lipid, part protein. The chylomicrons can be secreted through exocytosis into the bloodstream in high amounts during obesity and obesogenic diets, and can carry things like fat molecules and LPSs. The chylomicrons can release the LPS, contributing to endotoxemia and systemic inflammation, and also carry fat molecules like triglycerides to adipose, in which it can be deposited into the adipocyte, which would obviously further exacerbate the obesity condition. Now, evidence also shows that obesity can affect gut health in sort of a vicious cycle type of manner. Now, gut health is largely determined by the gut microbiota, more specifically, the gut microbial ecology. And this is characterized by the balance between pathobionts, or unhealthy bacteria, versus symbionts, or healthy bacteria. Now, pathobionts are pro-inflammatory species, while symbionts are anti-inflammatory species. Now, I don't want to take up too much time on this slide, but in summary, environmental factors, which include factors like caloric surplus, high-fat dietary intake, stress, and sedentary lifestyles, in addition to prolonged antibiotic intake, like say if you're on medication, can shift the gut microbial ecology towards the pro-inflammatory pathobiont side. And this would create a dysbiotic gut microbiota. This would lead to things like increased gut permeability or leaky gut, as we discussed in the previous slide, inflammation, endotoxemia, and even exacerbate obesity and obesity-related comorbidities. Now, gut health is indeed important for overall health, and obesity and obesogenic lifestyles are not at all in favor of gut health, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that to be the case. Even in exercise physiology research, we are seeing the connection between exercise and gut health, as well as in terms of the gut microbial ecology. Now, to add on to all this, what else happens during obesity, and how else does obesity affect the function of various organs in the body, irrespective of chronic inflammation? We have something called ectopic fat deposition, which refers to the increased intracellular storage of fat molecules, namely triglycerides or triacylglycerol molecules, in organs where they are normally not found, at least in high amounts. Now, ectopic just simply means in an abnormal place or position. So fat being stored in an abnormal place, or in this case, an organ. Now, adipose cells are the primary storage for fat and have a tremendous capacity to hypertrophy under conditions of prolonged caloric or nutrient surplus, leading to increased adipose mass or adiposity. Now, as we know by now, obesity is linked to a multitude of disease conditions as well as dysfunction of multiple organ systems. And we discussed that this is largely attributed to adipose and gut inflammation and the subsequent chronic low-grade systemic inflammation that stems from it. Now, going back to the negative changes in adipose during obesity, we know that adipose undergoes inflammation, which leads to metabolic dysfunction of the adipose cells. Now, part of that metabolic dysfunction is the impairment of fat metabolism, which would include the formation of fat stores like triglycerides. So the storage of fat becomes impaired in the adipose cells. So when this occurs, ectopic or abnormal fat deposition increases. So fat depositing in areas, in this case organs, where it's normally not found or stored in high amounts. So ectopic fat deposition increases because fat storage in adipose, its main storage unit, becomes impaired. Now, as presented in the graphic here, several areas of ectopic fat accumulation or deposition during obesity include visceral adipose, which is a type of adipose tissue that is not designated for fat storage. We got the liver, skeletal muscle, pancreas, and the heart or the cardiac muscle, which makes up a lot of the heart. So as alluded to by the term ectopic, these are organs in which the cells normally do not store fat in high amounts, nor have a relatively high capacity to metabolize fat. Thus, it can be said that these cells within these organs are in an abnormal state, which may directly or indirectly contribute to eventual dysfunction of that organ. So particularly high amounts of visceral adipose due to ectopic fat deposition appears to be highly correlated with comorbidity, especially heart disease and type 2 diabetes. Now, the main point of this slide is to again highlight the dangers of obesity. There is sufficient evidence to know by now that it is not a state in which your organs can thrive. Now, our health depends on the collective and integrative functioning of our organs and organ systems, which can be certainly disrupted by obesity through 1, chronic inflammation, and 2, as shown here, ectopic fat deposition. Now, going along with the topic of ectopic fat deposition, we know that obesity is largely associated with metabolic syndrome and diseases that are related, such as type 2 diabetes. Now, type 2 diabetes is characterized by impaired blood glucose homeostasis, in that the blood glucose levels remain elevated, which eventually can cause problems in various cells within the body. Now, what is the cause of type 2 diabetes and the state of chronic hyperglycemia? Many would say eating too much sugar, since blood glucose is also referred to as blood sugar. This is completely false. Eating too much sugar is not what causes type 2 diabetes. This is a very rudimentary and incorrect way of thinking. Now, insulin resistance, more specifically severe insulin resistance, is what underpins type 2 diabetes. In healthy individuals, when sugar or carbohydrates are eaten, blood glucose levels rise as the glucose is absorbed by the intestinal tract. When the blood glucose rises, the pancreas will detect this and secrete a powerful hormone called insulin. Now, insulin will circulate in the blood and interact with its receptor on various cells in the body, the insulin receptor. And these are expressed on a variety of cells like adipose cells, liver cells, and muscle cells. Now, when insulin binds to its receptor, it will initiate a signaling pathway within the cell. Okay, so this is called an intracellular signaling pathway, as shown here. Now, what's shown here is an abbreviated visual of the pathway. It's a little bit more complex than what I'm showing you here, but just for the sake of brevity, I went ahead and abbreviated that pathway here. So just in summary, this is the insulin receptor, and when bound to insulin, will activate insulin receptor substrate 1, which in turn will activate phosphoinositide 3 kinase, or PI3 kinase. This will in turn activate protein kinase B, also known as AKT, which will in turn activate the GLUT4 transporters, or GLUT4 transport proteins, which will bring glucose out of the blood and bring it into the cell. This is how glucose uptake is generally mediated by insulin. So in so doing, blood glucose levels will return back to normal levels. Now, this describes the normal mechanism of glucose control in the blood. So insulin resistance is essentially a defect in this entire process and is characterized by an impairment of the insulin receptor, so poor binding of insulin to the receptor, or blockage of the pathway immediately below it, like on insulin receptor substrate 1, or IRS1. Now, during obesity, chronic inflammation of a cell like adipose cells, as discussed earlier, can cause insulin resistance. And this is a major feature of obese individual with type 2 diabetes, adipose insulin resistance. Now, systemic chronic inflammation can in turn cause insulin resistance in other cells, especially muscle and the liver, which is usually when insulin resistance becomes severe enough in the body to really impact blood glucose control. Now, besides inflammation, however, ectopic fat deposition also appears to contribute to insulin resistance in a variety of cells, not just adipose, but also in cells like muscle especially. Now, this figure here demonstrates that mechanism. Now, during obesity, as I said earlier, there is greater mobilization of fats in circulation, and there's increased uptake of these fat molecules like free fatty acids by various cells in the body, like muscle cells, for example. And this is due to the impaired fat storage in adipose. So there is large amounts of free fatty acids, circulating lipids, in the blood, looking for a place to be stored in. So with increased fatty acid uptake, like say in a muscle cell, there will likely be an increased uptake of large fatty acids called long-chain fatty acids, which will eventually undergo reactions to be converted to long-chain fatty acid CoA, which is indicated here. Now, when long-chain fatty acid CoA levels increase within the cell, insulin resistance can also increase as well, because long-chain fatty acid CoA appears to be an inhibitor of the insulin pathway, particularly IRS1. So long-chain fatty acid CoA, when in abundance within a cell like a muscle cell or a liver cell, can disrupt this insulin pathway, which leads to glucose uptake by inhibiting IRS1. So even if insulin binds to the receptor, the signal does not proceed forward, resulting in impaired glucose uptake by that given cell that is insulin resistant. And thus, when this is happening at a high level within the body, you can imagine how blood glucose control would be severely impaired. This is one of the reasons why obesity is so interlinked to type 2 diabetes, because it is so causative to severe insulin resistance, not just in adipose, but in other cells in the body as well, such as muscle and liver cells. Finally, to conclude our discussion on the effects of obesity on health, we turn to epigenetics, which is the study of changes in gene expression via environmental factors such as lifestyle factors without changes to the genotype or one's genetic makeup. Now, you can think of this as simply switching on and off certain genes in response to some environmental factors like lifestyle factors. So research shows that obesogenic lifestyles, which include overconsumption of nutrients and sedentary behaviors, it shows that it appears to be linked to epigenetic modifications in that genes that regulate things like fat and carb metabolism are suppressed, while genes that promote inflammation are quote-unquote switched on. Now, just to be brief with all this epigenetic profile would clearly be conducive to poor health outcomes, favoring obesity, insulin resistance, and metabolic syndrome, to name a few. Now, what is interesting is that these epigenetic profiles or epigenetic modifications due to obesogenic lifestyles may be transferable from a mother to a fetus. Now, this has been designated as fetal programming. Now, most of this evidence is from animal model research, but it is something to keep an eye out for, as it would have serious implications to human health. Now, later on, we will also discuss how one of the benefits of exercise, more so chronic exercise or training, if you will, is that exercise is also an environmental factor that can induce epigenetic modifications that would counter the obesity epigenetic profile as described here. So to wrap up the discussion on the effects of obesity on human health, we understand that the connection between obesity and high mortality is explained by the link between obesity and diseases, or comorbidity. Now, the link between obesity and comorbidity can be largely explained by adipose and gut inflammation and its contributions to a state of chronic low-grade systemic inflammation, which negatively affects the metabolism of various cells in the body, leading to conditions like insulin resistance and just general metabolic dysfunction of those cells and therefore those organs. Now, obesity also increases ectopic fat deposition, which has also been linked to organ dysfunction and disease. Now, finally, obesogenic factors cause epigenetic modifications that are conducive to obesity and disease as well. Now, as you can see, this is not about body image or being sensitive to people of differing body weights. This is purely science and evidence. Obesity is clearly, per abundant scientific evidence, a condition in which your body cannot thrive in. So understanding how to treat or prevent obesity is of importance. And to understand that, you would need to first understand the fundamentals of body mass control.